Welcome to the View Magazine's Rebel Justice podcast. Today we have as a guest Eleni Psillakis, who fights against the unfairness of the criminal justice system by helping other women with a criminal record to re-establish themselves within society. Eleni Psillakis sat on the concrete floor of a women's prison, reflecting on the path of life experiences, mental illness, domestic violence, decades of unhealthy thought patterns, and the circumstances that saw her spend 11 months behind bars. She had never been in trouble with the law, had an extensive work history, is a mother, recently grandmother, daughter, aunt, sister, and niece. Sitting in that cell, she realized that it could be anyone that finds themselves behind the fence. What she didn't realize was how difficult it would be for many to look past the record. Those impacted by the criminal justice system are told to move on now, you have done your time, get a job, and contribute to the community. Yet, discrimination, stigma, and misperceptions within the community and amongst employers often prevent this, adding to the trauma of trying to re-establish yourself in the community. Eleni is now the manager of Success Works Partners, an organization which supports women with a criminal record build their resilience, employability, and confidence to present themselves to an employer who is willing to see them for their skills and potential, not their record. This is changing attitudes and lives.
Also recently a grandmother with some COVID grandbabies that were born during the last 2 years. Thank you. I'm a daughter, I'm an auntie, and I have an extensive work history, and never ever imagined that I would experience the criminal justice system here in Australia, where I live in Sydney. It was never anything on my bucket list to spend time in prison. And like most women in Australia in the criminal justice system that have experienced the criminal justice system, I have a lived experience of mental illness, domestic violence that I didn't recognise as such when I was in the midst of it. But it wasn't only after till my 21-year marriage started failing about in the last 5 years of the marriage that my mental health went down because of the domestic violence that I was experiencing, but thought it was my normal. So I have those things in common with most women that have experienced the criminal justice system here in Australia, but I also have an extensive work history as well, which a lot of women don't have. So, you know, having experienced this and sitting in a cell in a women's prison in Sydney, I knew straight away that I had to combine my professional experience and this lived experience to do something. So that's a little bit about my background. My background has always been in education, both in schools and in adult education and in the fitness industry. And it was something, you know, put together the perfect life storm where you make poor choices at a time when you're really vulnerable that saw me come into contact with the justice system.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I understand. You mentioned your time in prison a bit. I was wondering if there were any times you experienced any kind of abuse in prison as well, physical or psychological?
I was always worried about, because I'd never experienced, you know, any being in trouble with the law at all. So I was extremely frightened to be in prison. I spent 15 months on conditional bail before I was sentenced. So I was always worried about the fear of physical abuse in prison. And I guess that was because of the many portrayals of prison in Hollywood, in movies and things like that. and not having any understanding or knowledge of what to expect. I was extremely frightened of that. So I did do some self-defense classes and training in case I was going to be sentenced to prison, because I had no idea. So I did prepare as best I could for that. And whilst I myself didn't experience any physical violence, I know there were other women in prison that did. But the psychological abuse, I did experience a little bit of that from particularly one other woman who asked for some mediation because of the threat she thought I was, but I didn't do anything. It was around, at the visits area and people that were visiting her that she felt I was a threat in some way, but I didn't actually have any communication with any of her visitors. You're not allowed to. You've got to sit on your table. But for whatever she perceived, I felt threatened there. And I think just being in prison, I was always on guard 24 hours a day, worrying about what might happen in an environment like that where there's so many vulnerable women and not getting the help that they need. And, that was always a threat to me, and that having to stay on guard all the time impacted my mental health.
Yeah, I imagine. I was just going to say that must have really altered your anxiety.
I think just to add to that, going through that conditional bail process before I was sentenced and sent to prison, I actually was under the care of a forensic psychologist who I saw every week leading up to sentencing. And if it wasn't for the help that I got from her and what I call my unlearning of, what landed me in this position in the first place, and learning with her helpful tools to combat, the unhealthy thought patterns that I lived with for decades, if I hadn't got that psychological help, I don't know how I would have handled myself in prison if I did not have that help. So I was really grateful that I was under the care of a forensic psychologist for about 7 months before I was sentenced. And she gave me and helped me learn a lot of the tools, not only to address the issues that led to offending, but also how to handle myself if I was given a custodial sentence.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that was helpful. I know many of the women that end up in prison don't get that support beforehand. Yeah.
But did you have a gut feeling that you were actually going to end up in prison? Because you mentioned that you were, by the way you talk about before prison, it's like you were preparing mentally and physically to protect yourself.
Yeah, I didn't, again, because it was the whole unknown for me, I had to prepare as if I was going to be sentenced to prison. And for me to mentally go through this, the arrest court, the court process, the whole thing, I mentally had to prepare for the worst possible outcome.
Mm-hmm.
And that was one way that helped me go through that process as if I was to, because I think if I swayed my mental preparation that it was not a possibility for me to go to jail, and then I did get sentenced to jail, I don't think I would have coped as well. So I had to always err on the side that this is a possibility.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Other than the forensic psychologist, I was wondering if there was anybody in your family or your friend group that was part of your emotional support system at that time, that visited you maybe or kept in touch.
I did have the support of my family, but I have to mention that I was extreme from the moment of arrest. I deny from that moment of arrest, I denied that I was guilty until, this is to my family and friends, because I was so afraid that I would lose their affection and their love. And this is part of my upbringing with the mental illness. So I suffered with an eating disorder in my late teens and early 20s, where it wasn't anything to do with body image. And I bring this up because it was one of the things that this forensic psychologist helped me see. So my whole life, I believed that I wasn't worthy of love or valued unless I did certain things. And that stems from my upbringing, where I felt at home. I had to do everything. I had to perform a lot, doing chores and things to be seen as valuable or loved by my parents. I didn't believe that they loved me unconditionally, and that was not something that they portrayed to me, but that was my thought process. I have siblings that didn't think like that, but my personality type was that I felt that I wasn't loved or valued unless I said yes to everything. And in one of the early sessions with the forensic psychologist, she went right back to my childhood and my upbringing, and including the eating disorder, which had nothing to do with body, but the translation of me thinking I had to perform at home translated to the thought that I'll have to step back a bit. Can I go back? Can I backtrack?
Of course. Yeah.
So I was the eldest of 4 children, and when I asked to do anything that normal teenagers would do, my father's classic line was, "Subjects closed, don't want to talk about it." So I never learned to express what I was feeling. And I was only able to see my friends that were part of normal teenage upbringing when I was at school. I wasn't allowed to do anything outside of school. So when school finished, I got a bit sad and thought, what am I going to do now? Because school was the only place I could see my friends. So my mental health started slipping, and two clear signs of a mental illness developing are changes in eating habits, changes in sleeping habits, change in mood, and all those things happened for me. And the change in eating habits was that I just started eating less. My mood had dropped significantly for a period of, a couple of months. And then Mum and Dad noticed that I wasn't eating as much. And this was not a diet. I never weighed myself, was never interested in weighing myself or dieting. They noticed I wasn't eating as much. And they said to me one day, "What's wrong? Are you okay? We notice you're not eating as much." And in my mind, I went, "Oh, you're listening to me now." So it went into a full-blown eating disorder of anorexia. And my psychologist, decades later, when I was in trouble with the law, went back to that. And she said, "What was your dominant thought when you lived with anorexia around the restrictive eating and the excessive exercise?" And I had to think, and I said, the dominant thought was, if I don't do this, I won't be of value. And then she asked me in that same session, what was your dominant thought right before offending? And I broke down because the dominant thought was, if I don't do this, I won't be of value. And it was exactly the same thought as living with anorexia, but then decades in between of putting my hand up to say yes to things, even in my workplace, in my marriage, when I was exhausted and not feeling like I didn't want to say yes. I wanted to say, no, I'm exhausted, particularly at the end of my marriage, thinking that if I don't do this, I won't be of value. And it was decades worth of that thought pattern dominating my sense of worth, that unless I said yes to everything, I wasn't going to be loved or valued. And I said to her, why didn't I get help for this thought pattern decades before? And it really hit home. And I thought, how many people, not that they cross the line with the law, but live with this thought pattern that they're not valued unless they say yes to everything? And it was a real eye-opener. That was a light bulb moment for me. And it was since then, and that was early in the treatment, that she helped me not only help unlearn that thought, but also she helped me with learning to speak up for myself, because that was another thing that I learned. I didn't learn how to articulate what I was feeling. So to be assertive and speak and stand up for myself when I hadn't learned how to communicate properly. So that helped before I ended up in prison. I know that was a roundabout way of answering that question, but it was a pivotal light bulb moment for me that helped.
Exactly. I wanted to ask you if you remember how your recovery process was from anorexia, because usually with people who have body image issues with anorexia, there's a certain type of recovery process. But I imagine with you, there were many issues.
Yeah, so the physical recovery for me happened over a period of 2 years, where I started resistance training to put body weight on, because back then my doctor was, he threatened to put me in hospital on total bed rest. So I physically recovered by doing resistance training. But the true recovery came from the help with this forensic psychologist for that underlying thought pattern of the why that behaviour happened in the first place, and why the offending happened. Believing that I was not of value or loved unless I said yes. And that was the why of both. And you asked me before, did I have any family or friends support going through this court process? It was when I entered a guilty plea with the barrister that was representing me at the earliest opportunity. I pled guilty. And then I remember saying, and to my psychologist after I entered that guilty plea, saying, to now I have to face my family and friends and tell them the truth. And that was what I was extremely frightened of, because of that underlying thought pattern of, I have to be portrayed as this perfect wife, this perfect mother, this perfect daughter. How do I now tell them that I'm guilty of what I've been arrested for? And she said to me, what would real you do? And I said, real me would tell them the truth. So after pleading guilty to the barrister, and I always had their support up to this point, but I then chose to tell my brothers first. Mm-hmm. And their reaction was not what I expected. But I chose to tell them first, hoping that they would still love me. And they did. They said, sis, you're our sister. We know the state you were in at that point. Of course, we still love you. And that brought a little bit of healing. Yes, there were lots of tears. And then I chose to tell my children. They were 3 adult children at that point. And that was not an easy thing to do as a mother. And more healing came when my 2 sons and my daughter said, Mum, you're our mother. We know what you went through and we still love you and we stand by you. And I'm getting teary now thinking about that, telling them. But the hardest and the next was, my sister and my parents. So I went round to the dining table where we sat and ate as a family growing up. And I said to Mum and Dad, you know how I'm in trouble and why I'm in trouble. I said, it's true. And I can't tell you how hard that was after living for decades thinking that I had to please them. And no one in our family had ever been in trouble with the law before. Mm-hmm. And I broke down, and my very next question before they had an opportunity to respond to my statement was, do you still love me? And I was a mess. And Mum went, of course we still love you. You're human. And we know what you were going through. And I did not expect that response, because in my head for 40 years, believed that I had to be a good enough daughter for them. And Mum just wrapped her arms around me, and I said to them, my whole life I believed that I had to please you. I didn't expect this. And that was the biggest healing of all. And out of this whole experience of, prison, and this was the gold nugget for me. And this was the healing moment for the anorexia, and this was the healing moment for what I was going through. And if I didn't have that family support going through this process, and even friends that after I told my family, met with friends, and their support was unbelievable. Even people that I worked with came to visit me in prison. I had, and to have not only my family visit, my children visited me every weekend, but to have colleagues visit me it brought more healing. So the more support I got and the more love I got, and I tell you what, you know who your friends are when you go through something like this. They either leave you or they stand by you. And to have colleagues and family visit me in prison and write to me, it was just that brought the strength to go, okay, people are going to support me. And there was one line that a prison officer said to me. She said, those that mind don't matter, and those that matter don't mind. And I've really stood by that. That's been a strength for me. And another strength was when I was moved to a different prison after the first 6 to 8 weeks. That was scary in itself, going to a new prison. An officer tapped me on the shoulder because she must have seen the fear on my face when I was in the clinic line to get the antidepressant that I was, to be given. And she said, hey, there's a fine line between blue and green, because the officers in this prison, in New South Wales where I was, wore blue and inmates wore green. So there's a fine line between blue and green. Any one of us can be on the other side of the fence. And that to this day still brings healing to me, because she was one of the nicer officers. And yes, you're right, anybody can find themselves incarcerated, given, poor decisions, depending on the road you're travelling. And that was another healing moment. Yeah.
I'm speechless, to be honest. While you were talking, as I was actually thinking that your arrest and everything you've been through demonstrated and proved to you that you are worthy of love, worthy of appreciation. And I think that, as I've seen and as I've heard, I think your arrest and the moment of your arrest led to your realization that you are, that you matter.
I don't think I would have learnt that unless I had gone through this process and this experience. As horrid as it was, what I got out of it from the support I got from the psychologist that I should have got back in my late teens and early 20s, brought this realisation, and having my family continue to love me made me realise that, wow, I've had this so wrong, false belief for so many years, for decades, that it took this experience, as horrible as it was, and I feel for the pain that I caused everybody involved. But it was a huge unlearning process. Yeah. Don't know, I can't speak for all of Australia, but I've had a lot of conversations with an eating disorder specialist psychologist. And from what I experienced of meeting women in prison, there was a number of women who were people pleasers that also had experience of an eating disorder, just in those conversations with them. And I know the physical and the mental health of women in prison can be negatively affected and impacted, particularly around the medication they're given, the lack of fresh food in prison, the lack of support services for mental and physical health, and the nutrition in prison is poor. So, we know that research shows that our physical nutrition and the lack of programs around physical movement in prison as well can impact the mental health of people as well. So combine that with the trauma that women have already experienced, your mental and physical health goes downhill when you're incarcerated. And and added that to, what they're trying to deal with, prison is not conducive for correction, for underlying issues. No, it's just it actually adds to it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I was wondering if this trauma and shared trauma made you make any friends or make connection with other women?
Oh, definitely. There's one woman in particular who I remain good friends with, and she has been released, but I still have contact with her. And whilst I don't have any friends in prison now, I do have the women I work with. So I knew I didn't want to waste this experience. I work with many women who have been impacted by the justice system in the work that I do now.
Great.
Yeah.
Do you have I know this is a weird question to ask, but based on your personality and your mindsets, I think you're a very positive person and very strong person. And I was wondering if, thinking of this hard and traumatic experience in prison, would you think of any good memories, if there are any?
Yes, there were some good memories. One that I've spoken to, I only mentioned this to somebody yesterday. I've always had a Christian faith, and sadly, I have not experienced any church service outside of prison like I did the chapel service in prison, because everybody in there knew that they had made mistakes. And that was the most real experience of grace that I've ever experienced, was the chapel experience in prison, where out in the community, you can get many people, not just in churches, but anywhere in society, where they think they have this halo around their head that they never make mistakes. So it was a very real experience of grace, experiencing a chapel service in prison. And also I did experience a sense of community with, as one example, in one of the houses I was housed in, there was a group of Asian women that always lived in community together. And it was Christmas Eve. And they said to me, sister, you come and have Christmas lunch with us. And they had recreated meals from their prison meals and what they could buy on their buy-up, which is like a regular shopping list. And they recreated this beautiful Asian banquet and included me in their lunch for Christmas. And that was just beautiful. Really, for them to ask me was something I'll never forget. And that sense of community they had together.
Imagine.
Yeah.
How was the health of all of the women in prison, as observed by you? Did you have the urge to help them, or did you see yourself in them?
I wanted to help them because of my background. I had a fitness industry background, and also a diploma in nutrition and health education. I really saw there is a lack of health programs, but specifically that women could learn how to help themselves for not only their physical health, but also for their mental health. And I wanted to be able to do something. And I kept a physical health routine up. And when I did, whatever I could in prison for my movement, I did have some groups of women say, oh, you obviously know what you're doing, can we join in? And they did for a while, but I wanted to be able to do more. But because I was sentenced less than 12 months on a capacity working with the prison to be able to do that, I wasn't allowed to at a more formal level. But that is something definitely lacking in prisons for women.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Do you believe the poor living conditions in prison are the main reason for the poor quality of life and deteriorating mental health?
There is a lot of aspects about prison life that is deteriorating. The taking away the humanity, even just by calling you by your surname or your MIN number, is dehumanizing. The physical environment of the women's prisons in New South Wales are not conducive. Nothing about prison is conducive to rehabilitation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I hope that one day prisons will be organized and
I hope they die. I hope that prisons are non-existent and that more conducive rehabilitation in the community.
That's what I meant to say, that they transform into rehabilitation centers.
Yeah, exactly.
Because
there's other ways to rehabilitate people. Yeah.
This concludes our podcast for today. Thank you, Eleni, for giving us the opportunity to speak with you and learn more about the unfairness of the justice system. We hope this brings more awareness to the subject, and we wish you good luck in your journey of helping women re-establish themselves within society after spending time behind bars.